Pre-modern Islamic societies had a very surprisingly tolerant attitude towards premarital private encounters, if you will, including same-sex ones, in a way that was probably not very common in other cultures, and we can see that being predominantly represented in Arabic and Islamic literature for its entire existence. Here's how it looked like, and how did that change in the past 200 years. Before we start, I know for more like a traditionalist, this is going to be like a very controversial topic, so I'd just like to say that I'm not spreading fitna, and I'm not endorsing anything over the other. We cover Middle Eastern history here from like a modern secular historian perspective or academic perspective. No, that's not mustashriq or Oriental, and it's one of those things that are surprising, although they are clearly in your face. And if you study Arabic literature, as long as it's not censored, you know, if you like ever read Qais and Layla. As always, this is a good starter resource of the topic, although it doesn't have the full picture. I want to apologize in advance for that safe language, but like, I'll count on your imagination. In Edward Said's famous book, Orientalism, which was a demolition job on the Orientalist movement itself that turned Orientalist from an honorary scholarly term to an insult, Said criticizes this image of Eastern women that was commonly depicted in early Orientalist work as, you know, privately available, let's say, in contrast with the conservative Western woman. You know, this depiction even can be seen very predominantly if you look up Orientalist paintings, as you can see here. In the second half of the 20th century, this clearly has shifted into, you know, the oppressed, repressed woman of the Orient, also to serve a political goal. And although this earlier view was heavily politicized, it gives us our first hint at perhaps different social norms where the Orientalist thinker was casting a moral judgment on. So where does that come from? Just to be clear, traditionalist Islamic law views private encounters outside of marriage as strictly prohibited. But in order for any prosecution to happen, there needs to be 4 witnesses who witness the act itself. Weber Johansen famously argues that Islamic law is clearly not inquisitive, like, for example, medieval European law. It clearly separates, say, public spheres from private spheres, as in a sin committed in private, the idea being that someone can repent for that sin as long as there are no consequences, and prosecuting that with a harsh punishment is often avoided. And there's a famous hadith about a man who kept trying to go to the Prophet and confess committing private encounter, but he kept getting turned away. In fact, it was pretty common if a case was brought to a judge and the accusation happens through spying, for example, the case would be immediately dismissed and the person spying would be punished instead. If you accuse your neighbor of, having private encounters, but you fail to produce 4 witnesses, you're often punished instead of the person you're accusing. Now, this created a cultural context of kitman or satr, to make cover. As in, if you commit the sin in private, it's between you and God, but it's more, dangerous for your neighbors to talk about it because the court took qadf or accusation without sufficient proof as a very serious offense that is often punished. Court records from Ottoman Aleppo between the 16th to 19th century show many cases of extramarital pregnancy, or the rare case of 4 witnesses actually witnessing the act itself and coming forward to the court. They also show a very interesting aspect of same-sex encounters, but we discuss that later in the video. The very interesting thing is the number of cases was very high for the minimum threshold of prosecution that this had to have been a very common social norm. But this is not a unique case. In fact, it can be seen in Abbasid Baghdad, in medieval Cairo, in medieval Morocco, and most certainly in Muslim Spain or Andalusia. The court practically, by the way, did not do the flogging. More often than not, they did ta'zir, which was, in this case, to pay a fine, and then they would, seems to be very common that they would seek remedies through like negotiating marriage and dowry and stuff like that. A view of pre-modern Islamic society as secluded ignores the practical reality, the impossibility of that being the case in public for women. Women went to the market, they worked at the market, they washed clothes by the riverbanks, they went to communal olive pressing mills, or brought food for extended family who are working. Lovers meeting secretly on rooftops or by the well, or flirting in the market is such a predominant theme in Arabic poetry across all the empire for a very long time that it's hard to say that it's just a tradition. Andalusi Shahat, Ibn al-Arabi, Abu Nawas. And this aligns with like descriptions that Al-Jahiz gives us of 9th century Basra, or travelers like Al-Tanuhi, describing 10th century Baghdad. We see the same themes: lovers meeting secretly on rooftops, and flirting in the market, or the plenty of opportunities to meet secretly in public life. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to paint a picture where this was so common that like society just didn't care. In a lot of cases, the family cared about this concept of honor, which is if a girl becomes pregnant, then it's a scandal. But it was common enough because secrecy was possible. It was common enough that, and although it's extremely hard to prove, we still see a lot of cases of the variety, although many of them get dismissed or, an arrangement is reached. It's common enough that there are over 1,000 variations of contraceptives known in the Islamic world, which you would not expect given that after marriage, the culture is very pro giving birth. According to this resource, which name I won't read, it was common enough that there was a whole cover-up medical industry going on. Many references of unmarried girls going to the daya or the midwife, claiming they're having a blockage, which is code for missing a cycle, and the daya giving them, a mixture to get rid of what. But with how open this culture is reflected on poetry and Arabic literature, there's no place better to represent that openness like Muslim Spain or Andalusia, where prominent female poets wrote openly about illicit things. Famously, Walada bint al-Mustakfi, the daughter of the Caliph of Cordoba himself, who refused to have a husband and instead wrote about her illicit relationship with Ibn Zaydun. This was not considered a scandal or a major scandal back then. I waited to talk about the men's side of things because there's a very important piece of the puzzle here that would make the image a lot clearer. Qiyan was a class of women that existed, also called the singing girls, that is very comparable to geishas. They were, of course, a class of not free women, in Islamic law, you're not supposed to rent out unfree women, but due to a loophole that's too long to explain, they just happened and became socially and legally acceptable. They can be compared a bit to geisha, where they would work often in entertainment settings, but also had a lot of cultural influence. At least some of them, they would become like the celebrities of their time. They'd often work in salons where they would sing and dance for the guests, but also socialize with the guests and sort of get to know them. It was socially and legally acceptable in many cases to seek these women, either for an exchange of payment or if it's mutual, they often formed a romantic relationship. Relationships with Qiyan were so popular that there's a whole genre of, the singing girl and her lover, and her master, who prevents them from seeing each other because he wants her to make him more money, as seen in the Kitab al-Aghani, or the Book of Songs from the Abbasid period. But to see or date or even pay a single girl was not a social taboo. It was something that men bragged about, in fact. In some periods of time where the age of marriage was delayed due to economic hardships, like in medieval Cairo under the Mamluks, it was the expectation that a man would go and seek out Qiyan, and again, not a social taboo. Tishali and others argue that this class of women led to more and more nuanced view culturally beyond the binary of marriage versus sin. If some encounters are accepted and even expected, then there's less reason to have a moral panic about others. It also contributed to redefining the hijab from a class signifier that distinguished free women from the others who were not allowed to wear it, to a practice that exists to prevent sedition, which would not make sense historically, given that other women roamed the street in revealing clothing and were not. Before we talk about same-sex encounters, we need to clarify a few things. First of all, same-sex acts are considered a sin under traditionalist Islamic laws. However, there are large disagreements on the severity of the sin. So while the Maliki or Hanbali schools have a much more harsher view, in this case, the Hanafi school, which was certainly the dominant school affecting the Abbasid Empire and the Ottoman Empire, views it as less severe than heterosexual acts. It was commonly punished with a fine, and that opinion is what influenced the Ottoman Empire to decriminalize same-sex encounters in the 19th century. Second thing is, there was no sexual identity in pre-modern times. As long as someone will eventually, get married and have kids and play that role, having same-sex encounters was seen more as a sort of like boys being boys, or it was not scandalous at all, or having lesser zina, which is the heterosexual encounter. But it would not be counted as a scandal at all. But what would count as a scandal is whether they were on the receiving end, for example. That for some reason was more scandalous. Also, female same-sex encounters were often seen as a much, much lesser sin in comparison. Of course, much like in heterosexual encounters, a prostitution can't happen without 4 witnesses who witness the act as it's happening, setting a very high bar for prostitution to happen. Lesbian cases were often dismissed, by the way. Love poetry or flirtation poetry is probably one of the most produced forms of art in the Islamic history. Now, it's often written in a language that seems to be ambiguous, typically making it seem that the subject of the poem is a man. But there exists a very surprising mountain of that makes it very clear how unambiguous it is that it is by a man for a man. A good example of this is Abu Nawas of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th century. Now, this is not poetry that he wrote in secret. He was a frequent guest in the Abbasid court. This was seen as high art. Another surprising figure here is Muhammad II, or Muhammad the Conqueror. The Ottoman ruler who conquered Constantinople, ending the East Roman Empire, was known for writing under a pen name, love poetry that is sometimes very explicit about his male lovers. Speaking of caliphs and rulers, there's a surprising amount of incidents or situations that are similar to this. Although the caliph is supposed to represent spiritual leadership as well. Caliph Al-Amin, who's the son of Harun al-Rashid, the greatest Abbasid caliph, was known for his lack of interest in his female harem. In fact, he spent a lot of time in public with a harem of male servants. This only became a scandal because, there was an issue of succession and yet an heir was not on the way. His mother Amina apparently prepared a female harem dressed in male clothing to sort of try to mitigate the problem. Since he would go outside with this new harem now, this started a fashion trend in Abbasid Baghdad where women would start wearing male clothing. In Andalusia, Caliph Al-Hakam II was known to have a very strong preference for men, so much so that he just refused to touch women and could not produce a hair. Even after his wife cut her hair, started dressing in male clothing, and called herself Jafar, which was a male name. But this was not just something that the ruling class allowed themselves to indulge in. Imam Ibn Hazm, who's also a Muslim scholar in Andalusia, talked about how he sees that same-sex encounters were common and people were socially accepting of it. It was apparently common enough among Ottoman soldiers that they would usually appoint someone to keep an eye on new soldiers and their superiors. On surprising attitudes towards gender as well, there existed a class of people called mukhanathin, or men dressed in women clothing who had no desire for the women. Although there was an early rough patch with early Islam, it's very clear that later on they were fully integrated. They were often the only biological males allowed in female harems for things like matchmaking, hairdressing, and entertainment. A manifestation of that existed sort of like as recently as 19th century Egypt, where they would be hired to dance in weddings, for example. We could go on and on and on, but it's very clear that today's attitudes are very different in Muslim majority society. So why did that happen? Given that same-sex poetry was still being written in the early 19th century, we know that this change probably happened between the mid-19th to early 20th century due to many various reasons that took effect at the same time. Of course, for a change that happened this quickly, we can't really point out to a very specific reason, but we can sort of theorize on why that happened. By late 19th century, the majority of the Islamic world came under Western colonialism. And this is around the time reformist movements such as the Salafis in Arabia and Deobandi in India, for example, gained prominence for claiming that the Muslim world lost favor with God due to straying away from his teachings, which required a sort of a return to a more literalist or early traditionalist interpretation of Islam. The interesting thing is, of course, that this version or this view of the religion did not exist even in early Islam, sort of like having a moral panic about the sins committed in private spheres as well, in order not to lose favor with God. This came to resemble more, medieval Europe's attitude towards sin than it did early Islamic history or even any traditionalist history in Islam. But this also, took a turn into a more inquisitive philosophy of jurisdiction, where previous Islamic jurists, for example, would, go the length of trying to sort of dismiss private sin. Now, here's the very funny part. When French and English Orientalists arrived in the Islamic world in the 19th century, they were horrified. Male friends holding hands, cross-dressing dancers, women being active in public life and, not having a moral panic every time they interacted with a man. Like, Edward Lane. It's a very entertaining read. Like, I highly recommend it. Of course, they wrote books about how Arabs are morally backwards and how effeminate they are and how they were degenerates for not caring about the degeneracy happening next door, for example, and, didn't spy and report the degenerate sins happening in private. The elites in the region, of course, read these books. So on the other side, you had elites who want to become more like the Westerners who were, looking down on their own culture and how open it was and how, it didn't have a moral panic every time someone sinned in private. And of course, we know that this tactic even worked in India to convince the Hindus who wrote the Kama Sutra to also turn on same-sex relationships and their acceptance of it in the early 20th century. And of course, the cherry on the top was applying Victorian law to the Islamic world. Let's focus on women for a second here, because honestly, it was a moral panic-inducing period that permanently shaped and changed the culture. Women were highly restricted from markets and public life, public indecency laws, and for the first time, morality police. Morality police, which were in a few Islamic countries in the early 2000s, chasing you to cut your hair. Yeah, that's a Victorian invention. Raids and random inspections, random medical inspection to ensure that women were not sinning. This period broke the culture so significantly that every Islamist movement since has been just an attempt to go back to Victorian law, and I can prove it. Egypt's 70s Islamic movements, a desire to return to Victorian law. Iran's 79 Islamic Revolution, it's just a return to late Qajar dynasty when they were pressured to adopt European law. Crazy one, Taliban, inherited British India and Soviet policing models, plus Deobandi Islam, which was born under, you guessed it, Victorian law. The common factors here are inquisition and surveillance over kitman or secrecy. obsession with conformity, clothing, behavior, and opinions. Moral panic over degeneracy every time there is even the slightest divergence. You can never find a pre-colonial Muslim culture that operated this way. Yet magically, medieval European law and the spirit of the culture worked exactly like this. Reformists would tell you that, for example, Sufism is a bid'ah or an invention that should be avoided because it added things to the religion that was not there in the first place. But what's a bigger bid'ah than replacing the entire spirit of not just the jurisdiction but the culture with a foreign, incompatible set of values that are imported from elsewhere? Because high bar requirements like 4 witnesses witnessing the act itself was the standard for 1200 years. This is not a model that is compatible with replacing that with text evidence and then punishing something that would be commonly punished with a fine or like 3 years in prison. This is not about just sexual freedoms. It's about the spirit of the culture itself, the factors that leads for a culture to either succeed or fail. Maybe you're not convinced, but there's proof of that everywhere you look once you start seeing it. In 1985 and 2010, there were major cases in Egypt to either fully ban or censor Arabian Nights. The argument was that, given that it has very inappropriate scenes, same-sex and opposite sex too, which is, by the way, very true, that it was going to lead to, quote unquote, and remember this very well, corrupting the youth. Okay, Arabian Nights, again, a work that has started accumulating from Abbasid Baghdad, and at this point, one of the most celebrated works of fiction in Arabic literature. Surely, given that these stories existed in like every coffee house from Cairo to Damascus to Baghdad since like 8th to 9th century, that other Islamic jurists probably had moral panic over it too and tried to ban it or censor it. Absolutely not. Some jurists expressed their dislike of it and saw it as a waste of time, but there was never a moral panic over a work of fiction that existed for over 1,000 years. Meanwhile, if we examine the Victorian translation by Edward Lane, which is heavily censored, with footnotes, of course, about how immoral and scarring the Oriental is, but he couldn't publish it uncensored even if he wanted to, due to the Victorian Obscene Publication Act, which was instated due to moral panic when the printing press was still new, over the idea that, it would, and I quote, corrupt British young men. It's all freaking Victorian era nostalgia.